Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
This interview is brought to you by Pacific Atrocities Education, who is hosting a one-day event in San Francisco on September 18th, 2025. The event is called History Remembered. Be sure to get your tickets today.
My name is Jeremy Kuzmarov. I teach at Tulsa Community College, and I'm managing editor of Covert Action magazine. And I've authored 6 books on U.S. foreign policy. The most recent, I'll have a book coming out on October 1st called Syria: Anatomy of Regime Change. And I also published a book on police training programs in the Cold War called Modernizing Repression, Police Training and Nation Building in the American Century, among
Wow.
other books.
Okay. All right. So, the theme of this year's Pacific Atrocities Education Conference is History Remembered. What does that phrase mean to you as a historian who often challenges dominant historical narratives?
Well, I think that there's the famous phrase, he who controlled the past controlled the present. And we see constantly, political agendas and, powerful governments or institutions are trying to rewrite the history or sanitize the history to serve a particular political agenda or serve their own power interests. So the role of the historian, I think, becomes very important in this context to try and, tell the truth, to try and tell the real history as best as they can, and show, unfortunately, often history, there are, terrible things that go on in history. They're the dark side of human nature that one comes to recognize in studying history. But I think it's vitally important so that people in, power, people who commit atrocities, are held accountable for their actions, and that we don't see a repetition of those crimes. Knowledge is power. And if we get the truthful narrative out, I think it could have a big impact in the present.
I get that. There's a pretty common phrase, not just within the history community, of to the victor goes the history. There's a definite national bias when it comes to documenting and preserving certain stories over others. So,
Absolutely, yeah, and that can be very dangerous, whether it's in Japan, whether it's the United States, because it fueled this hyper nationalism that could lead to more and more atrocities. So, if people are reminded of the true history and recognize that, they may have more humility, and they're not going to rush into wars. War is horrible, and I think it's important to study war, just how cataclysmic they are and how terrible the costs are for civilians, and how leaders often manipulate public opinion in support of those wars. And more people who are conscious of that will try and push back against efforts to start new wars based on, false pretexts or this hyper nationalism.
very well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So, public history work often walks in line between education and advocacy. How do you approach this balance within your own work as being a published author and an advocate of repressed histories?
Well, I think it's important to lay out the facts for people. I think that they're often looking for knowledge, if they're going to be reading a book or students in a class, or if you're giving a lecture. I think the best you can do is to present as honest and accurate a history as you can. And that is through marshaling a lot of evidence, detailed evidence using the sources that historians use, primary sources, secondary sources, authors who studied the topic and written about it. And if you can present good, credible information to people, they will respect what you're saying. And also to encourage them to do more of their own research to build off the presentation you've given. And so people can, come to the truth for themselves.
Yeah,
So ultimately, it can have the effect, yeah, of advocacy, but I think the job of the historian is just to try and recreate that history as best as they can.
I get that. It's more or less about education over anything. You
Hmm.
are right. Knowledge is definitely power. Well, you brought up primary sources. PAE focuses very heavily on primary sources, survivor accounts especially. How do you approach the ethical responsibilities of working with these kinds of materials within your own research?
Well, yeah, I think primary sources are very important. I mean, it's important first, and this is, in graduate training, which I think they do a very good job of training historians. Unfortunately, it's hard to get a good job these days working as a historian, but I think they train you very well. That first you have to read the secondary sources, and often you'll get a good picture, and there may be competing interpretation of certain events, but sometimes one interpretation will supersede another because that author has done his homework more. He's researched certain documents that other previous historians hadn't examined. Or yeah, as you get further from the event, it's a bit easier to be more objective. During the time it's very politicized, and they're so-called court historians who just kind of present the government narrative. But usually then over time, revisionist historians come about with more critical interpretations, and they may draw more on primary sources. But then, yeah, it's important to do as much research as is feasible in primary documents to be able to assess the different argument and the evidence. So, yeah, and oral histories can be very valuable. Of course, people's memory sometimes can change over time. So, I think we're trained that you want to get as much. If it's oral histories, one is good, but you want to get, if you have many people saying the same thing and giving similar testimonies, then that adds credibility. And if it's just one or two people, because sometimes, yeah, people's memory can be cloudy and stuff, but obviously, yeah, oral history can be a very valuable source. Those are the kind of sources, yeah, historians often work with: oral history, newspapers, government records. And yeah, often government will incriminate themselves and document, like, say, Japanese war crimes or American crimes, and say Korea or Vietnam. They're often documenting what they're doing and how many people they're killing. Like, I've done a lot of research in the U.S. National Archive. It's kind of chilling, and looking at certain program. They were One is like the Air Force. Sometimes I would have goosebumps on my arm because, like, I was doing research on the Korean War, and I was reviewing the pilot logs in the National Archive, and they're like reporting how many people they killed that day over North Korea. It's like they're tabulating a list: animals killed, people killed, houses destroyed, and you're like, I mean, those are real people. It doesn't come out on the dot, and that's what was to me so chilling, is that there's no humanity in it, but that it's just like a kind of sanitized report, but they're documenting, again, people, animals, homes destroyed, and you just think, well, those are real people whose lives were destroyed. And I met a lot. Some of the pilots felt remorse years later. Um, so those are some documents I've worked with that raised alarm for me about just at war and the horrible costs, and how people's lives are kind of devalued. It just becomes a statistic.
I will say, when it comes to wartime records, I've been doing my own research into World War II myself, and it really does become, especially when the documentation comes into play, it's dehumanizing.
Absolutely, yeah. And often what you find is the enemy is referred to in a pejorative term, and that's the key. So in World War II, from the American side, the Japanese were referred to as Japs, and that comes out in the document, whether it's high-level government documents or soldiers' memoirs. They talk in the vernacular. Whether it's in Vietnam, it was the Gooks. And I was recently at a conference on the Vietnam War, and there were Vietnam veterans there and pilots, and they're still using that term. Like, we after we went to the bar and stuff, and they were talking, telling war stories, and they were saying,
Wow.
using that term, and then they're like, "Oh, we're not. I know we're not supposed to use that, but I mean that's how they talk even to this day." And it was the same. I knew a lot of World War II veterans, and they would refer to them as Japs. And I think that's a process of cultural conditioning that occurred. And the one thing I've showed students in the past I found powerful was the Winter Soldier hearing, where American soldiers testified about the atrocities they had committed in Vietnam. And what was especially interesting to me, and that's why I show it to students, and it gets the students really are affected by it, especially I think young men, some of whom may have been wanting to join the military. They see that because it describes the process of dehumanization that they underwent during boot camp and how the Vietnamese were demonized, and also how they used the rabbit trick where boot camp is a very harsh process over 30 days where they really worked hard. And it discussed how the army commanders would give them a rabbit, so something to care for at night, to kind of keep their humanity and to have a positive emotion like a pet. And they said on the day before they went to Vietnam, they would take the rabbit from them and snap its neck right in
Oh,
front of them to break them down so that they commit these atrocities. So that's very powerful and shows how armies, condition hardened soldiers before they go to war. And I don't think that's unique to the American Army. Unfortunately, that's quite universal, and that's one reason, yeah, war, strips people of their humanity.
yeah. That's awful to hear that that happens, but I could believe it honestly. When it comes to training military soldiers, it's definitely an institutional thing that takes place. And when it comes to your research and how you explore historical narratives are shaped by institutions, how do you, or any recommendations that you would have for educators or historians who are seeking to disrupt the harmful or incomplete narratives without alienating audiences?
My advice is, yeah, just to present, good grounded information. Use primary sources. Sometimes videos can be very effective, like this video. However, it is a very critical video, but it does reach a lot of people. I mean, and I think it's powerful because these are young American soldiers. It's hard to, and they're describing exactly what they went through in the boot camp and how that led to their behavior in Vietnam. And that has been conveyed in certain movies like Full Metal Jacket, that I thought was one of the good movies about the Vietnam War,
I
because it
have a
all,
few friends who love that movie very much.
yeah, because it actually is based off the Winter Soldier hearing. The first part, they show the boot camp experience and how it hardened them. And
Wow.
then the second half has them in Vietnam. So um, those kind of films or documentaries can be powerful, just in conveying a certain reality, and it reaches people, yeah, and that may have a huge impact on young men who have this kind of romanticized image of joining the military. So I think yeah, the best that educators can do is provoke critical thinking and try and introduce, critical concepts and analysis. And as long as they maintain a respect for students and encourage students, I usually assign research papers just because it gives them the opportunity to pursue these kind of topics on their own and develop their own conclusion. I don't want to kind of ram in their throat a certain worldview or ideology. So, and sometimes that could garner resentment. So, as long as you sometimes take a step back and give the student autonomy to pursue his own research and respect his views, because yeah, you may have students with a very conservative or military families in your courses. So to just try and be respectful of them, but at the same time, yeah, introduce to them material that may provoke critical thinking, or I think is important.
Well, I think I think you also just covered what my next question was going to be, and that was how do you navigate educating our diverse American culture, especially when it comes to our youth. A lot of our youth is using, you know, they're definitely using more digital media than what we were as kids, and they're definitely getting more perspectives and insights. But other than movie media, how else would you recommend us to help to kind of pull in and educate the histories and atrocities to younger audiences?
Well, yeah, I think you have to recognize they may have a bit lower attention span than past generations. So, yeah, I think you can use the internet to your advantage by showing clips in the classroom or assigning documentaries or short documentaries. And there are a lot of good historical documentaries that have been produced, whether about World War II or Vietnam. So, yeah, I think there are opportunities to use the internet to reach students. And there are a lot of primary documents that they can access online. So I often do assignments where they can get documents online, and that's their primary source, and they analyze those documents, or they use that as part of a research paper. And there are, yeah, certain websites that offer kind of repositories of documents, and there are also some good online, publication like our magazine, Covert Action Magazine. It may not be that widely known, but we have a lot of historical articles on the website, and they're kind of short articles that are very accessible to students. And there are other websites, where you can get kind of shorter article instead of assigning a whole book that maybe only half the class would read. Sometimes there's articles you can, provide them online that provide kind of concise summaries of certain key events, or even, firsthand, you may get oral history. There are a lot of universities that have oral histories. So with, soldier interviews, so assigning that kind of material, I think can be very effective as far as the student learning process. So that would be my advice.
That's great advice. What is your preferred database for research? What do you like to use for your archives? What's your go to?
Mm, well, it depends on the topic. I mean, for U.S. foreign policy, one good website is the National Security Archive at George Washington University. I know they sue the government for to release documents, and they often will provide a summary. They'll get a core of documents together on a topic, and they cover a lot of controversial topics like CIA coups and stuff like that. And they'll marshal together, 15 important documents about those events, and they provide a kind of summary of what the documents mean. So that's very valuable for students, and it's good for doing, if they're, if you assign a research paper, they can use, they get a summary that they have the primary sources there, and they've often selected key documents because, as you know, doing archival research is very cumbersome because a lot of the documents you get are just routine bureaucratic documents that are not at all interesting. You usually have to spend a whole day, and you may get 4 or 5 documents. You go through 1,000 documents, and there are about 10 maybe that are of value. So it's very, can take days and days in the archive, and they've done a lot of the legwork because they've sifted through the documents to pick out the key ones that actually reveal something important. So that's just one website. A lot of universities, yeah, have websites where they have like things like oral history. So it would depend on the topic. Now there is a website I can recommend that I contributed some of the essays. Oh yeah, I wanted to mention this.
Yeah.
It's called the Peace History website. I can get the URL. If you type Roger, because the creator of the website is named Roger Peace, so it's Roger Peace here. I'll look it up right now because and this is actually a website that has, here. I'm getting the yeah. It's Peace History /usfp.org.
Okay.
And this has essays on every war in American history,
Oh,
including the
cool.
Pacific War.
Okay.
Uh, and it's really kind of designed for students. it's like an overview. It's a readable overview of the war. It draws on both, secondary and primary sources, and it provides kind of concise overview, and it assesses whether it's a just war based on certain principles of just war, like whether it was defensive or offensive, or the way you conduct the war also can factor whether it's a just war. If you're committing horrendous atrocity and no regard for civilians, even if you were attacked in the first place, many who've thought about this question would say that that's not really a just war. So, and yeah, I did the one on the Korean War. I also did the one on World War II with Roger, and I focused a lot on the Pacific War. It's somewhat American centric website, so
Okay.
it's a lot on the American side, but it also has a lot about the Japanese. Yeah, it tries to be balanced, and it presents the conflict from different perspectives, like from the civilians, from the soldiers of both sides, the government of both sides. And I think that's a good approach to war and peace because, to get students to see the other side, especially teaching in the United States, because, we're used to the media just frames it all around America, and it doesn't often give a good understanding of other countries the U.S. goes to war with and their political dynamic. And that's usually why the U.S. had not won any wars because, as Robert McNamara acknowledged, we knew nothing about Vietnam, we knew nothing about the Vietnamese, and you can say the same about Iraq or Afghanistan. So, I mean, that just from a practical point of view, you can't win a war if you don't know the other side very well, and you get into these quagmires. It seems to be a feature of U.S. foreign policy. So, it's especially important, to try and understand the other side. So, to get students to do that, I think is important. Going back in history. That's how conflict between nations can ultimately be resolved. If people have better understanding of the so-called enemy, they could reach a common ground usually. So that's my approach, and that's the approach of that website as far as the various war, because it goes back to the War of 18. Their essays on the War of 1812,
Ooh.
Mexican American War, Philippine War, all through Korea, Vietnam, yeah, I helped with the World War I. The World War II, I did a lot on the Pacific War, and then yeah, the Korean War I wrote, and then Vietnam I helped with. So
Oh wow. No, that I'm definitely going to promote the website for sure.
yeah,
Okay, so from what you've just been explaining and everything, you've written extensively about these wars, and you've written about how war and surveillance affect society beyond the battlefield. In what ways does the legacy of that affect how we understand war crimes and historical accountability in today's society?
well, yeah, wars can breed a poisonous effect. There's an excellent study by Alfred McCoy called "Policing America's Empire: The United States, the Philippines, and the Rise of the Surveillance State." And he shows how he looks at the U.S. colonization of the Philippines and the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and how certain formative figures in U.S. military intelligence, like a Colonel Ralph Van Diemen, set up this elaborate surveillance apparatus in the Philippines, as part of the counterinsurgency operation to hunt down the nationalistic and ultimately messianic peasant and some Muslim rebels in that context to secure U.S. colonial control. And then he shows how Van Diemen came back to the United States and helped develop the same. He learned all these techniques uh, and owned the approach towards surveillance and counterinsurgency. And then this had a highly detrimental effect on U.S. democracy because then he collaborated with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI's radical division to use the same methods to spy on dissidents in the United States, and often those may have been civil rights leaders or left people involved in the labor movement or left wing political party that were completely peaceful and legal, and yet they were subjected to surveillance and often strong arm methods, like in World War I when they raided and destroyed. The Wobblies was the Industrial Workers of the World, was a left wing union that was trying to promote worker run industry, and they were accused of being agents of the German Kaiser. There's this kind of paranoid mentality that you have when you're fighting a war or colonial subjugation, and they brought that kind of paranoid mentality that anybody who criticized the government in any way or was trying to reform the economy was a subversive, and they use that kind of dehumanized language, and then they use strong arm methods where they're arrested, deported, their offices are ransacked. I mean, pretty violent police methods, just like in the Philippines, to subdue the nationalistic rebels. So that's he kind of shows how democracy was corrupted by these overseas militarism and imperial endeavors. So, and I think that continues today. For a lot of people here in the United States, the danger of these overseas wars that we slowly lose our democracy. We become more of a militarized police state, and they use counterinsurgency methods against Americans and discourage Americans from voicing their constitutional right to dissent or to voice their opinion. So, and a lot of people, whether right or left, are alarmed about that. So, I think that can be underscored, as part of an anti-war type education in the United States. So it's less open about actually honest historical inquiry that could lead to positive social change and more peaceful foreign policy. You have more of a fascist type environment within the United States, and we've seen a lot of repression in education in the last years, and this is coming out more and more. Now with the Israeli Gaza conflict, there have been a lot of professors that were fired, I think, because they were teaching a Palestinian point of view, and there are these hit lists. I've been put on some of them. If you're critical of
Really?
the if you're critical of the Ukraine government, they put you on a hit list. And there's a canary mission where if you write articles or they get these militant students to spy on the professors, and if they voice anything that seems to be critical of the Israeli government, you're placed on their hit list. And I wrote some articles, one in the Huffington Post, and they said I was anti-Israel. In fact, I was simply reporting certain historical facts, and as an educator trying to explain that conflict. And ultimately, the goal of conflict resolution, you have to explain the Palestinian side and their grievances, and that's important in the Jewish community where I come from, to try and understand the Palestinian their grievances, and recognize that there are legitimate grievances on the Palestinian side with Jewish people. Sometimes they're loath to do so. But anyway, I got on a hit list, and there's these professors who were fired. So, and that's been going on a long time in academia. As much as it has a kind of liberal veneer, there is it's hard to bring up some of these issues without facing repercussions as professors. And that's, I think, a ramification. It goes back to the McCoy book, that we're seeing more and more of a fascistic type environment, which is antithetical to democratic ideals. It all goes together. But yeah, I think Americans value their freedom and civil liberties and the right to debate. People may not always agree, but we do have the right to raise these issues and debate them. And I think most Americans want that. So yeah, I think it's important to highlight how the repression comes about, in part through that militaristic foreign policies, and the so-called military-industrial complex has a boomerang effect, and destroys our own democracy.
I agree, and I'm sorry to hear that you've. Unfortunately, war is very messy, and
Yeah,
when it comes to being a historian, we tend to, uh, Feel it on both sides.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the historian is also typically the messenger, and the messenger typically gets shot. So,
Yeah.
I,
I mean, that's our job. You know, the history is not always very pretty.
no, it is
So
not,
it
and
is
not
our job to kind of highlight that so we can learn from history. I mean, ultimately, we want to do better in the present. We don't want to repeat the same problems.
exactly,
And that's why a
exactly.
lot of students I encountered, they're very open. They want to know the real story, and they want to do better. So
I think
I
that's
think
the
we,
true mark of a historian is wanting to know the real story, both sides of the story, and wanting to learn from it and do better. So,
yeah.
oh yeah, but it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I'm so excited to get to meet you face to face at the conference in September. Is there anything that you would like to say closing out this interview for our viewers?
No, it's just, yeah, I think it's really great organization, and I came about the topic, you know, the Japan atrocities in part because I was studying U.S. foreign policy and U.S. military occupation of Japan, and how the MacArthur administration was kind of rehabilitating a lot of those war criminals, and getting them off of prison and bringing them into the Japanese government because they were anti-communist and more on the right, and they were worried about the left, and they didn't want Japan aligning with communist China. And then I looked more and more into it, and yeah, in Japan, I studied Japanese history, and I think there was, it's too bad because I mean. I understand the impulse behind the Japanese, they were because of the history of Western colonization and how Japan felt they could help Asia to, defend it from Western colonization by strengthening themselves, and then kind of providing the leadership in Asia with the co-prosperity sphere. And I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for Japan initially in the early 1900s, but obviously they went too far when they, in their heavy-handed way, they ruled over their colonies, and then the brutal invasion of China they carried out. Yeah, it's really important to understand the history, and so I'm really glad to participate in this conference. And it's a fascinating history. So
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. But thank you again so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
same to you. Yeah.
This interview is brought to you by Pacific Atrocities Education. Be sure to check out their website to view their upcoming History Remembered conference happening in San Francisco in September. Thank you.